Hi, this is Jack Lucero Fleck from 350 Bay Area. I was on the planning team that put together the CapTrade workshop, and those of us on the team would like to add a few comments at the beginning to set the context for this video. The subject of CapTrade is complex and cannot be fully explored in a 3-hour workshop. We feel that the speakers all have excellent information to present, but we know that this workshop is not the end of the discussion. The speakers' opinions in this workshop are their own. We in 350 Bay Area feel that an exchange of different views is healthy, and we are confident that viewers of this video can sort out where they agree and disagree. One important note of disagreement: caps on refinery emissions. 350 Bay Area favors caps on both greenhouse gases and co-pollutants at local refineries. One of our speakers, Dr. Severin Borenstein, does not support caps on greenhouse gas emissions. He does favor regulations to cut co-pollutants. Reasons for 350 Bay Area's position include: CapTrade does not guarantee that frontline communities will actually experience reductions in pollution, since its aim is to reduce greenhouse gases statewide. CapTrade does not address co-pollutants at the local level. So far, frontline communities have not experienced a reduction in toxic emissions from heavy emitters under CapTrade. This is one reason we need local caps on heavy emitters, along with other policies such as reducing pollution from transportation. Refinery plans to import tar sands and dirty oil will possibly increase pollution for frontline communities. Local caps on emissions are not inconsistent with a cap-and-trade program that caps greenhouse gas emissions statewide. Local caps on toxic co-pollutants are both consistent with AB 197 and, in fact, are practically demanded by AB 197. In order to reach the goals of SB 32, AB 197, California will require many policies that decrease emissions radically over the next 15 years in the areas of industry, transportation, energy generation and delivery, energy-efficient buildings and homes, and environmentally friendly cities. As climate activists, we must learn about all of these approaches and push our local and state governments and regulators to devise and implement effective and just policies that improve the quality of life for everyone. We hope you enjoy the video.
Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to get started. Thank you so much for being here on time. There's a lot going on in the world around us, especially around climate change, but other issues as well. I'm Kathy Dervin with 350 Bay Area, and when we first started planning for this workshop last September, it was right after the legislative session had ended. And we have been working very hard with our legislative committee on several of the big climate bills that managed to pass. SB 32 is the big one, extending AB 32. And during the summer, there were a lot of discussions going on about, well, where does cap-and-trade and carbon fees and taxes fit once AB 32 transitions? Or going forward for the state. So we decided we should do an educational workshop, and that's exactly what you're at today. This is then designed as an opportunity for gaining deeper understanding of cap-and-trade as part of, and it's only part of, which you're going to hear about from our speakers, of the many initiatives that California has to address climate change. So it's designed that way. We've been very fortunate to get some great, very knowledgeable speakers with us today to share their knowledge and understanding and participation in some of the cap-and-trade design elements and policy decisions that have been made to address this part of our climate change policy. And so we have a schedule. If you look at your agenda, everybody should have an agenda. Why don't we just look at that for a minute? It's really designed to provide us with information from experts and then have time for questions and answers. Most of you are here today because you're a climate activist And that's exactly who this is designed for. We didn't open it up to 300 people of the public because we really want people that are working on these issues to have this deeper understanding and have the opportunity to talk with really knowledgeable people like our speakers and with one another about where is California going with this particular piece of our climate policy. So you can see kind of several different panels, the first panel, and then an environmental justice panel following after that with plenty of time for questions and answers because we want you to ask your questions and to get as many of those answered as we can. These are complicated programs that the state is in the process of various stage of implementing. They're challenging, and it's actually pretty hard to understand them all. So hopefully all of us will gain a deeper understanding of the role CapTrade plays, what it is, how it works, where it's going, how it may change, as part of the overall state climate policy. So, first of all, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. We're extremely fortunate today to have this space, courtesy of the National Sierra Club. How many people have not been to this new national office before? Whoa, great. Well, here it is. Here's the National Sierra Club, which moved about a year ago from San Francisco, their historic headquarters, here to Oakland. And they make this space available to community groups, and so we want to thank them a lot for making this available. And I also want to thank our co-sponsor. So this workshop was developed by a planning group from 350 Bay Area and with the co-sponsorship of the Bay chapter of the Sierra Club, who we work very closely with. And many of you are also from groups that we either have worked closely with or we would like to build stronger working relationships with as we go forward and all tackle climate change together in this new, very challenging environment that we find ourselves in. So, a few logistics. You've already found the food. It's in the back. Please keep taking whatever you like. Go ahead and help yourself during the workshop. We have a pretty packed agenda. So please, if you want to get up and get some more coffee, just help yourself because we won't have a lot of breaks. We ask that you do that, now that you're situated on your table, that you go out to the side aisles and go to the back of the room because the videographer is going to be filming right up the middle here. So help us out with that. Let's see. Yeah. Just many people have asked about the bathroom, so let's get that out of the way. So you go out this door, go left along these cubicles, past the two glass doors that have a beautiful Sierra Club kind of embedded in the glass, and it's the left turn after that, the hall after those two glass windows. Sound okay? Anybody who's already been to the bathroom? You found your way and you found your way back. That's excellent. Okay. And we'll keep replenishing some of the coffee as we go through the morning. We are going to be handling questions. We originally thought, let's have 30 people together. Well, we have about 50 here. So we decided to handle questions using cards. And I know that's not as spontaneous, but it is a way for us to kind of group some of the questions together so that we can make the greatest advantage of our speakers and have them answer your questions. So on your table, there's 3x5 cards. So as you're listening, go ahead and write down questions, and we'll have people come around and pick them up. Yeah. Throughout the talks, and then as each speaker finishes, we'll have a time for questions and answers. So let me just tell you about the agenda. The first panel is kind of two of our expert research policy speakers, John Balmes and Severin Borenstein. So I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a minute. They're going to each have a period of time to speak, and then they'll have 10-minute questions after that. When both of them have spoke, we'll bring them both up, and we'll have 10 more questions to ask both of them. So the thing is, their presentations build on each other, So don't ask Dr. Balmes all your questions about CalEnviroscreen, because Dr. Borenstein is going to go into much more detail. But Dr. Balmes knows about the broad California Air Resources Board kind of policy arena and how this entire program has been built up. So you can ask him questions about those things. Just so you know that there'll be much more detailed presentation on CalEnviroscreen. Okay, please, we'd ask you to silence your phones. Just so we're not interrupted, and we are filming this, so we don't want a lot of like beeping and interesting sounds on your phone answering machine. Okay, I think that's about it, except to say that the time we're in really calls all of us to be working more together, to be helping one another understand the policy initiatives, the levers, the way we as activists can weigh in and have the most impact, both to support legislators and legislation and our state agencies and our local governments to do more, because we are definitely called on to do more. And California, whether it wants to or not, and I think it wants to, is really being thrust into even more of a leadership role right now. And we need to, as you know, the public and organized groups really need to be there with information, giving input, providing public comment, and lending our expertise as people involved in our communities and our organizations. So this workshop is offered in that spirit to help us become more knowledgeable so that we can play that role. So again, I want to thank you all for being here today. And if you have questions as we go along, there's a couple people, the planning committee is kind of scattered around the room and they have volunteers, so please just ask people if you have questions or problems of some sort. All right, I think we're going to get started. So if you turn your, well, I don't know if everybody got the handouts, but there's biographies for our speakers, so I'm not going to read through all of this because they're very esteemed and have long resumes or CVs. But we're going to start off with John Balmes. John is a physician at UCSF Medical School and also teaches at the School of Public Health at UC Berkeley, so he has a joint appointment, which you'll see when the slides come up. John is also on the California Air Resources Board, so he's an appointed member of CARB, which is the body that makes a lot of the guiding decisions for the Air Resources Board and figures out how they're going to implement a lot of the laws that the legislature passes. And the other thing about John is that he's been there for a while. So he's seen these programs evolve, develop, be proposed, develop, evolve, and be implemented. So he has that perspective of a kind of a long-term steward at the CARB board, really making decisions and guiding how the state is implementing its climate change work. And you can read, he's a researcher, he's done a lot of research on asthma and respiratory health, so he has a great knowledge of the health effects of climate change and the exposures from fossil fuel industry, and you can take a look at his longer resume. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to John.
So you want me to speak with this mic? Which is fine. Aside from the fact that it's a beautiful Saturday morning and I'd like to be outside, I am pleased to be here. My role on the California Air Resources Board is as the person with statutory responsibility for public health. It's always been a physician, but doesn't actually have to be. It's supposed to be a public health focused individual. And I take that responsibility seriously, and it may be what I wrote up when I was having to be confirmed by the Senate for the position that caused me to get no Republican votes. I'm actually the first physician member of the Air Resources Board not to get a single Republican vote. I was up at the same time as Mary Nichols, and she got at least one. Thank you. But I wrote up that I was also concerned about environmental justice. So maybe that's why I didn't get a single Republican vote. I don't know. So You all know that AB 32, which is called the Global Warming Solutions Act, is the act that drives California climate change mitigation policy, and it's the act that gave CARB responsibility for implementing climate change mitigation policies. This was co-sponsored by Fran Pavley, who, to me, is a truly great hero in terms of the environment in California, and we will miss her now that she's turned out. The primary goal of AB 32, again, as I'm sure this audience knows, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. And then it also envisioned an 80% reduction below 1990 levels by 2050. That's now controversial, as I'm sure many of you know. And it required a scoping plan. I came onto the board in January of 2008, just as we were starting work on the scoping plan. And again, to remind you, there is a menu of strategies. There are direct regulations, monetary and non-monetary incentives, and market-based mechanisms were actually envisioned in AB 32. It did not prescribe CapTrade. And we'll talk about carbon tax, which I'm sure many of you are very interested in. So just to give some highlights about the menu of policies that have been implemented since 2008 under the scoping plan. There's the advanced clean car standards. How many of you drive hybrids or battery electric vehicles? Yeah, I thought there'd be a lot in this crowd. I just sold back my cheater Volkswagen for a Chevy Volt. There wouldn't be Priuses if it wasn't for a car. And then the evolution to truly zero-emission vehicles. Clean fuels infrastructure, this is talking about charging stations for our battery electric vehicles or hydrogen fueling stations for fuel cell vehicles. I thought about buying a Toyota Mirai, which is a really wonderful car, fuel cell car, but there's no place to fuel it around here. So, the low carbon fuel standard, which has really pissed off the oil industry. We require low carbon intensity fuel and increasing amounts of that. And the Sustainable Freight Transport Initiative, in some ways, is potentially the most transformative of the policy initiatives that we have at CARB. This envisions basically electrifying the entire freight movement system and applying modern day technology to be more systematic to avoid unnecessary use of vehicles, especially gas or diesel powered vehicles. We got a long way to go there, but it does potentially have major transformative effects, and Governor Brown is very much behind it. The Renewable Portfolio Standard, which Severin knows more about than me, has been very successful, and we'll talk a little bit about that when I have a slide about SB 350. The Sustainable Community Strategy that came out of SB 375 wasn't formally part of AB 32, but it actually really was part of the scoping plan to reduce suburban sprawl. And then the cap-and-trade program, which only is supposed to contribute about 16% of the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for California. So a lot of people don't know that. It's just a sliver, actually. A significant sliver, and one that gets a lot of attention, but it's only a sliver. And this slide actually is supposed to depict this. On the left, we have the sources of greenhouse gas emissions in 2008, when we first did an inventory of this. And you can see that between transportation and power generation, that's 2/3 of the emission. And then the emission reduction strategies are shown on the right pie chart. And you can see that cap-and-trade is only about 16%. Clean car standards and low carbon fuel standards are like 40%, and renewable energy efficiency about 30%. So, what is cap and trade? Again, I think most of you know, but I want to say that it complements other measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions under AB 32. It's not supposed to be the primary driver. The cap limits total greenhouse gas emissions from all regulated sources. The cap declines over time, reduces emissions, so we get tighter and tighter as we move forward. Participants are allowed to trade state-issued greenhouse gas emissions allowances. And industry likes this because it creates flexibility and reduces cost of compliance. And it works together with command and control measures and additional regulations. And this is how it's supposed to work. On the left, we might have a clean facility that has been able to reduce its emissions so it doesn't need all its allowances. On the right, we have a dirty facility that is not able or unwilling to reduce its emissions, so it has excess CO2 emissions beyond its allowances, and it can buy allowances from the clean company. Now, obviously, and it actually even shows here, with the excess CO2, there are excess toxic emissions. So, since this is very much an environmental justice audience, I totally understand the concern about local emissions being a problem with the cap and trade concept. We'll talk more about that. So market mechanism to reduce carbon emissions. This was, again, envisioned in AB 32. Didn't have to be cap and trade. Cap and trade is what we got. So here's the pluses and minuses about cap and trade. It caps carbon emissions. That's a strength. I'll show you why. But the price of carbon fluctuates with the market, which means there's always a chance for speculation. I'm sure you all remember energy deregulation a decade or so ago, and so has dealt with that. That makes it more complicated to administer. We have all sorts of checks in place to try to prevent cheating. Now, a carbon tax actually doesn't cap emissions. There are variable carbon emission reductions. It depends on the price of carbon that's set with the tax. And aside from the issue about whether it's politically feasible to even have a tax in the first place, which is coming later on this slide, if you get the price wrong, if you pick the wrong tax, you may have to adjust that, and that's going to be hard to do too. So while it's simpler to administer than cap and trade, it has that relative inflexibility politically. And there's the governor who had the good sense to appoint me, despite the fact that I was a Democrat. It was actually interesting. Mary Nichols, the chair, actually nominated me to the governor, but I also got nomination from a coalition of environmental justice and asthma groups in Fresno. So when I went to the governor's appointments office to get vetted, they said, "You're a Democrat. You've been nominated by environmental justice groups in Fresno. If you want to get nominated, or you want your nomination to go through, I need you to get some business endorsements so I can at least get a couple of Republican votes for you." I actually got those business endorsements, and I still didn't get a Republican vote. So the goal of cap and trade was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and hopefully to spur innovation technologically with regard to companies learning how to be more energy efficient and reduce their emissions. And it's also envisioned in AB 32. We wanted to get co-benefits with regard to reducing criteria and toxic pollutants. And it's flexible, so regulated entities like it. So a little bit more. The cap is the aggregate limit on greenhouse gas emissions from 2013 to 2020. We don't necessarily have authority past 2020. That's controversial. The Air Resources Board lawyers feel we do. Governor Brown feels we do. But we're being challenged about that. The California Chamber of Commerce is challenging us, considering cap and trade to be a hidden tax, and it needs to be authorized by a 2/3 vote of the legislature. It's important to remember that individual facilities don't have caps. They get allowances based on their emissions inventory from 2008. So they're sort of capped, but it's the overall cap in terms of million metric tons of CO2 is for the state. And the cap covers 85% of California's greenhouse gas emissions in terms of the facilities, even though we only use it to get about 16% of the reduction. It's just that there are other ways that we control emissions from the facilities. And here are the capped entities: large industrial sources, power generation, and power generation initially got free allowances. Utilities got free allowances, but they had to return them to you guys. So there wasn't a rate shock. So I don't know if you remember, you got climate change credit a couple of years back. That was because they got free allowances initially. Transportation fuels started in 2015. That's also part of the reason that oil companies are angry. They feel like they're under the gun both for cap and trade and for the low carbon fuel standard. This is a sort of complicated, yeah, I agree with the laughter. It used to be the auto industry that CARB fought with, but the auto industry, partially because they had no choice during the recession, has really played ball. I mean, there are over 20 different zero-emission vehicles available to Californians now. They put billions of dollars in investment, and the oil industry is now really vibrant, rather than the auto industry. So this table is a bit complicated, but it actually describes an allowance, which is the authorization to make 1 metric ton of CO2 under cap and trade, and then there's offset credits, which is supposed to represent a real and verifiable emission reduction of 1 metric ton of CO2. Outside of cap and trade allowances. Now, I know offsets are very controversial. Again, it was an effort to provide flexibility to the regulated entities. I'm not a big fan of offsets, but CARB has tried to be very rigorous about ensuring that the offset credits really are for emission reductions. And industry has pushed back and said, we need more offsets. There's not enough offsets. I don't know if Seb's going to talk about offsets at all, but it's an issue, and they're only, I think the next slide, actually. They're only in the U.S. so far. They're certified by the Climate Action Reserve, independent entity for CARB. The greenhouse emission reductions are monitored. And here's some specific projects. I think this is most of the offsets. I may have missed one or two. And the mine methane gas capture was something that the Sierra Club was fighting. This is for coal mines. Coal mines, when they're retired because they're no longer profitable, they still emit methane. And methane, as you all know, is one of the short-lived greenhouse gases that has 21 times the potency of CO2. So it's where we can make a big difference early on. So that's why CARB wanted to do mine methane capture. But the Sierra Club was very concerned that this would allow borderline profitable coal companies to keep mining. And so I pushed back hard. This is one of the times I realized I had power. Most of the time I don't feel like I'm so powerful, but I was the voice on CARB that said, because the Sierra Club came to me, they said, John, do you want to do anything to promote coal? I said, no, absolutely not. So on the dais, 1 month, I said how bad this was. But the staff, well, I have to say, most of the time, are very impressed with our staff. They go and do their homework. They actually showed me how it wasn't going to, the actual additional income revenue that mining companies would get from this methane mine capture wasn't going to make a difference economically, and it was actually going to help some California companies that had created a technology to capture the methane. So I ended up voting for it. give you a little example of how sausage is made. So there's been some recent legislation the last couple of years, and I know you all know about SB 535. This was a very important effort on the part of environmental justice groups, working with some folks in CARB, actually. And this requires that some of the greenhouse gas revenue from CapTrade be directed specifically to disadvantaged communities. And this is the original bill, which said 25% had to be spent on benefiting disadvantaged communities, but only 10% actually had to be spent in the communities, which means port electrification would be considered to benefit a disadvantaged community around the port, but it wasn't a direct investment in that community. I believe subsequent legislation now says that 25% has to be spent in the disadvantaged communities, but I'm not 100% sure of that. Yes, I was trying to look up, I couldn't think of them, I never remember the numbers of these. So, I was trying to look it up yesterday, actually. 1550 now requires that 25% be spent in disadvantaged communities. CalEnviroscreen, I'm sure most of you know about this, is a mapping tool that Manuel Pastor, Rachel Morello-Frosch, my colleague at Berkeley, and Jim Saad provided the intellectual framework for. CalEP is rolled with that. And this is a map of California using CalEnviroscreen 2.0. There's a 3.0 that's coming out. And you can see the red areas that are disadvantaged are concentrated in the Central Valley. I have problems with CalEnviroscreen because it uses like 11 different parameters. Some of them are socio-demographic, poverty, and others are related to pollution, but not just air pollution. There's water quality and pesticides. And so part of the reason that the Central Valley is poor, they do have the worst pollution in the state now, southern San Joaquin Valley. But they also have pesticides and poor water quality, so that's why they do better than the people have been complaining the Bay Area doesn't get that much in the way of disadvantaged communities, but that's because, relatively speaking, even poor communities in the Bay Area are better off than Imperial Valley or rural areas of Central Valley, and we don't have pesticides, and our water quality is good, and our air quality is good too, actually. Not to say they aren't hot spots if you live in West Oakland or West Richmond. So it's not a perfect tool, but it's what we have right now. And this is what determines who is disadvantaged or not for getting CapTrade revenue funds. I think Laura Cushing is going to be speaking later, so I'm not going to steal her thunder. But just to say that I really appreciate the work, again, of people I very much respect, and Rachel's a good friend, to try to assess with data how we're doing in terms of environmental equity, basically around these big facilities that emit a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And the other time I realized I had power on CARB was early on, in 2008, when I pushed back because environmental groups were asking me to about, where are we going to get co-benefits in terms of reducing health-damaging pollutants while we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because that was mandated in AB 32. What's our mechanism? And I was poo-pooed when staff was briefing me, but I bitched enough that 2 days later I get called from Chuck Sherlock, I think is his name, Joe, who was in charge of the scoping plan, and he said, Dr. Balmes, what do you think about this audit mechanism where high greenhouse gas emitters are also then audited about their toxic pollutant emissions? I said, sounds like a good idea. Now, that was 2008. It's now almost the end of 2016, and I keep bugging them about where's the juice. But actually, they've been working on it, and we'll get to that. I added this slide yesterday because I went back and read Kathy's invitation email, and she said, John, you're supposed to talk about 350 for this group. So, again, 350 is interesting legislation. You know, we're supposed to have a 50% reduction in gas vehicles by 2030, and we don't have that part. Why don't we have that part? Because the oil industry was able to peel off moderate Democrats, and so I think that's a lesson. The governor said we lost a battle. Well, we haven't lost the war, but we did lose that. And so we were supposed to increase our renewable electricity portfolio and requirement from 33% by 2020 to 50% by 2030. We're already on target to meet the 2020 goal, so I think it's quite doable. And we also lead the country in energy efficiency, so I think we can do that. But what's nice about 350, and that's probably why you guys are named 350, is the focus on low-income customers from disadvantaged communities. And there are, you know, baby steps being taken with regard to trying to meet this mandate. You know, I just bought a Chevy Volt. I told you that. Well, I don't qualify for the state rebate because I make too much money. That's fine, because rebates have been increased for low-income folks. They've been doubled. I still don't think it's enough to really get poor folks to buy still fairly expensive zero-emission vehicles, but you know, there's a step. If you live in the San Juan King Valley and are poor, you can practically get a little Fiat electric vehicle, 500E, whatever it's called. You can probably get it for free. SB 32, another Fran Pavley effort. This was to try to get us past the 2020 goal, and she took, you know, we need to get, it's really 2050 that we're working towards, but this is, I guess, Fran decided this was doable to try to ensure that we have emissions reduced to 40% below the 1990 level by 2030. Remember, 2020 is 30% below 1990. Actually, that's not true. It's a 30% reduction. Okay? This bill would become operative only if AB 197 was passed. And 197 is an interesting bill. I actually had a hard time reading the press about it because being a current board member, we were getting vilified in the press by legislators that I might have comments about. But because I think we were trying to do our job. But I actually am supportive of the goal of 197 to try to do a better job at dealing with co-benefits to disadvantaged communities. So, CARB is now required, at least annually, to have this report about emissions, to present an informational report to the legislature on these same emissions, so greenhouse gas emissions, criteria, pollutants, toxic air contaminants, and this is going to tie back into this audit. I'm almost done. At least annually on its website, the emissions at a more granular local level. And so this is where this audit, now called adaptive management, comes in. So this was just the update that was given to me 2 weeks ago for our last CARB meeting. And here's the adaptive management process. I don't know how well you can see this in the back, but so facilities that are high emitters of greenhouse gas emissions are prioritized for an investigation to see if they're releasing other types of health damaging pollutants. And then this is all going to be publicly available data, and then there'll be efforts to try to address these excess emissions and health damaging pollutants through regulatory means. And there's going to be a visualization tool available to the public. It's not currently ready for prime time, but it's supposed to come out early in 2017. This is a map of California showing all of the high greenhouse gas emitting facilities. think there's 51 or something like that. And what this tool is going to be able you to do, and I've played with it, you put your cursor over one of these facilities, and right now it'll tell you about particulate matter and oxides of nitrogen, NOx emissions, 2 criteria pollutants. But it's supposed to have toxic data in 2017. Now, toxic air contaminants, that's a wide array of chemicals. CARB's not going to give you every one. So they'll probably pick a couple marker VOCs or toxics, like maybe benzene, for example. They haven't told me yet, so but this is going to be a tool that groups like you represent can use. So, my last slide. I don't have to tell you the sources of air pollutants that harm our health are the same as harm our climate. And to improve air quality and mitigate climate change, we need to move away from reliance on fossil fuels, which, we had a partner with the Obama administration on that, with the Clean Power Plan, but I'd say the Clean Power Plan is dead. So we need more renewable power that's not fossil fuel driven, and we need more people driving zero emission vehicles, or better yet, active commuting, or taking public transit. That's clean. So thank you. Let's read some cards out. No more calls, we have a winner.
So if you have questions, please hold your cards up. We have about 10 minutes. This is a great opportunity to ask somebody on the CARB board and a physician, what some of the most important things are going on at that level. So I'll just start with this one. Will the scoping plan goal to cap all emissions at 20% reduction guarantee that refinery emissions will decrease by 20%?
No, it won't guarantee that. We feel that refineries are incentivized to reduce their emissions through the current set of regulations, but it's not guaranteed. Very little is guaranteed in this world, including elections. But that's an issue, without question. Refineries emit all sorts of nasty things, and people who live near refineries are justifiably concerned about, their exposure. The nice thing about AB 197 to me is that it now formally tasks CARB with trying to reduce hotspots, like around refineries. And the legislature is paying attention to it, to the point that 2 extra non-voting members of CARB will be legislators, are actually going to be at our meetings. And that's on top of the year before, we have 2 new members that are charged with environmental justice. Diane Debora and former Senator Dean Flores are the 2 folks. At least one of them is a true environmental justice.
Why are emission allowances freely allocated when pricing is still as low as $12.95 per metric ton? And the reference is the Stanford Social Cost of Carbon study.
Yeah, Sev will probably go into this more. The idea for giving electric power utilities free allowances was in part to, as I mentioned, to give that money back to ratepayers so there wasn't rate shock. That the economics of that I'll leave to an expert. CARB gave much less in the way of free allowances than the European Union did when they started their CapTrade program. We deliberately did that because they got burned. The price of carbon never really recovered from the fact that so many allowances were free. So I'm going to defer a more informed discussion of that point to Sev, because he's an expert on that. But we're not giving free allowances now.
How can we get more of the public of California to understand and be engaged in climate change efforts? Can the state put more resources into public education and public engagement?
This is a very good question, one that I have great sympathy for. CARB is a great agency in my view in that we have a staff that's very technically competent. We are relatively transparent and listen to stakeholders. In fact, the line that I have is, if regulated entities are pissed at us and the environmental advocates are pissed at us, we're probably doing okay in terms of moving forward. But the public doesn't have a clue about what we're doing. I always ask I teach at Berkeley. I have bright Berkeley students, both undergraduate and graduate, and I ask them, have you ever heard of the California Resources Board? You know, like 2 hands come up in a whole classroom. So CARB doesn't do a very good job in communicating to the public, and we need to do better. A number of board members agree with me. So hopefully, we'll have the health department of California, I think, has sometimes done really amazing work, such as the anti-smoking campaign directed towards youth. It requires resources. We have to put resources into public messaging. How much greenhouse gas emissions has the cap-and-trade program been able to reduce in California? So I don't know if Laura is going to show some slides from her report, but we haven't done so great so far. I mean, we're on target for our 2020 goal, but it's not like there's been an amazing reduction so far. And maybe some of the reduction is even due to the fact that there was a recession a few years ago. So electric power has gotten better. It's the most dramatic sector drop, but interesting enough, a lot of that's imported power. And within California, our utilities haven't really done any kind of dramatic reduction. So that's one of the conclusions of Laura Cushing's report, is that we haven't done so great with cap-and-trade so far. That's independent of the equity issue about who gets exposed around cap facilities. Is there anywhere in the world where cap-and-trade has worked to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Well, I'm not enough of an expert on the European Union situation. Maybe Sev could talk about that as well. The one trading program that everybody points to was the SO2 reduction program, the East Coast coal-fired power plants. And that actually ended up being cheaper than people even thought. But it's a lot less complicated to reduce SO2 from a single source coal-fired power plants than the multi-source greenhouse gas emission program that we have now. So, that's a good question. I think it's too early to say that cap-and-trade hasn't worked in California, and that's Laura Cushing's report says that, I think, correctly. But it's also too early to say that it's been a raging success. By the way, just so you know where I stand, I wanted a carbon tax when I came onto the board. Before I came to the board, and I was on a phone call being vetted by environmental advocacy groups, so I thought it was a safe place to say that I was for a carbon tax for the reasons, for the concern about environmental justice issues around high emitters. The next day, I was working on green chemistry with the Department of Toxic Substances Control. The next day, somebody in DTSC, unrelated to CARB, I thought, said, by the way, Dr. Balmes, if you want to get nominated by the governor, you won't talk about carbon tax again. At least we can talk about it now.
Someone rightly asked, are the materials going to be available? Yes, they will be available. I saw people taking notes feverishly. We will share the slides with you.
What specific data need to be collected on co-pollutants by the high emitters? it's not the high emitters that are collecting the data. We are going to identify high emitters. We already have identified them, and then we are going to collect data on, it would really be estimated emissions of criteria and toxic pollutants. We have the modeling tools to be pretty good about that. And then we will, what the plan is for CARB to work with the local air district to figure out the best ways, regulatory ways to address those emissions of health-damaging pollutants. Toxic air contaminants are generally regulated by permits that facilities have to get. So if we find that there's a lot of benzene being emitted from a refinery beyond what there should be, then their permit they'll be dealt with through a permit process. So it requires cooperation with the local air districts. Why not more emphasis on active transportation by car, which potentially has huge co-benefits? Well, this is something near and dear to my heart. I totally agree. As a public health guy, not only do I want to reduce exposure to pollutants, but I want people to exercise. So yes, SB 375, the Sustainable Community Strategy, does have some active transport components if a metropolitan planning organization wants to do so. So SB 375 requires metropolitan planning organizations to reduce million metric tons of CO2 by reducing vehicle miles traveled. That's the metric that we're using. So they can do that either by, building around high-density transportation corridors or public transportation, or you can do it with active transportation facilitation by putting in bike lanes and bike paths, etc. So I ride my bike most of the days when I go to school public at Berkeley, and I'm a big supporter of active transportation. Thank you all. It's really great to have our next speaker.
Remember, we'll have some more time when both of them have spoken to ask both of them questions, now that you kind of see how the evolution of the presentation is going. So I've held back some questions that you submitted that may be either more appropriate for Dr. Borenstein or both of them to answer. Okay, thanks so much, Dr. Balmes. All right, we're going to turn this over to Professor Severin Borenstein, who's the E.T. Grether Professor of Business Administration and Public Policy at UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. And he, too, has a long history of involvement in CARB's development of the CapTrade program and looking at other economic impacts of taking these measures in California's economy. And again, you can take a look at his longer resume here, but just to get us started, let's turn it over to Dr. Borenstein.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate this opportunity to get to speak to you. I'll just say a few things about my background that I wanted to emphasize. I actually was not part of the process of forming AB 32 or the CapTrade program, but I and a few others from the Energy Institute were brought in early 2012 to do what was referred to as a stress test on the program and figure out what might go wrong, because I had done work prior to the California electricity crisis that sort of forecast what might go wrong there. And that was called the Emissions Market Assessment Committee that I served on, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about today came out of that work. I'm also on the advisory council of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and in that context have actually been, our council has been asked a lot of questions about refinery-specific greenhouse gas emissions caps, and you will see I have strong views on this, as I do on many things. And I'm also chair of the Petroleum Market Advisory Committee for the California Energy Commission, which is a completely different sort of concern. That's about why gasoline prices are so damn high in California and what we can do about it. But it actually interacts very closely in ways I'm going to talk about, particularly when we think about where our gasoline comes from and what might change that. So John did a great job of setting this up, so I'm going to move fairly quickly through the early part of this presentation. Economists often talk about caps versus taxes, and the public policy debate has often been about that. And in theory, the idea is a cap gives you assurance on how much will be emitted, but uncertainty about how much it will cost. A tax gives you assurance about how much it will cost per unit, but uncertainty about how much will be emitted. And that's sort of the simple theoretical view, but in practice, it turns out the world is much more complicated. What California's cap-and-trade market did is, John talked about it, covers most of the greenhouse gas sources from fossil fuels. It omits ag. It is legislated through 2020. It's unclear what happens after 2020 even now. There's a certain cap, 2,508 million metric tons over those 8 years, plus some that can come from offsets. And I share those concerns about offsets, though I have to say the ARB has been much more rigorous than almost any other agency worldwide about auditing offsets. Minus some allowances that are held back from about 12% as part of the allowance price containment reserve that are only released if the price goes higher, and I'll show you how that works. There are 3 compliance periods. An entity at the end of each one of these compliance periods, 2013, 14, 15, 17, and 18 to 20, has to turn in allowances to cover whatever they emitted during those time periods. They can save them up, that is, they're bankable. They can also borrow from the future a little bit. About half of the allowances are handed out free, and my understanding is they're still being handed out free to the electric utilities and to the industrial polluters, emitters, based on how much of the product they're actually producing. And there actually is a good reason for that for greenhouse gases, which is the concern that if you say to an industrial emitter, to a refiner in California, you can't emit greenhouse gases, they won't. We'll just import a lot more gasoline. And if we do that, it not only doesn't reduce greenhouse gases, it increases greenhouse gases because, first of all, those facilities are in unregulated areas, and second of all, you have the transportation cost. So there was concern that recognition California is not the whole world, and we trade with the whole world, and we have no choice about that, by the way. Only the federal government can make trade policy, and we can talk about what might happen now after the election. So most of the free allowances go to the utilities. They are passed through to customers. Some go to these trade-exposed industries, refining, cement, etc. Tailpipe emissions, which came under the program in 2015, and which are almost half of all of California's emissions, 40% of California's emissions, are completely paid for, and that goes into your gasoline price, and it raises your price about 10 cents a gallon. So this is, in a sense, the very simplistic view of what happens. You start from some business as usual level, and this is part of the problem of the way people see cap and trade is they think of this as a known quantity, and what I'm going to show you is that's a big part of the problem. It's not a known quantity. And then the idea is if you set a cap on how much can be released, then the cheap stuff, the stuff that has very low cost of being abated, people will cut back. But if there's something that there's really no substitute for it, or it would be very high cost for a company to reduce its emissions, they then just buy allowances instead of reducing their emissions. And the idea is for any given quantity of emissions that reduction you want to hit, you hit it in the cheapest way by doing the things that you can do least expensively, and you do the least damage to the economy. Because, of course, if California does this in a very expensive way that hurts the economy, it sets a really bad example. In fact, it could undermine worldwide adoption of greenhouse gas reduction. And we do have to remember that's the only goal that matters. California can set all the numbers they want, but California is about 1% of worldwide greenhouse gases, and it's the total of worldwide greenhouse gases, regardless of where they come from, that is going to determine climate change. So California's activities, I think, I view as most important in setting an example, in setting a pathway for the rest of the world. Our marginal reductions are going to have almost no effect directly on climate change. So what are the complications? The first complication is that the amount of abatement necessary to meet any cap number depends on what the business as usual would have been otherwise. That is, it's the difference between this unknown level of business as usual and the cap. And John referred to this. Yes, we're going to come in under the cap by 2020. It has very little to do with the cap and trade program, almost nothing. It actually doesn't have that much to do with all the other programs in California. It's primarily that the cap was set in 2006. We then had a huge recession that massively set back the California and U.S. economy. And so we are now digging our way out of that, but a slow economy produces fewer greenhouse gases. And that's the main reason. And that's very hard to predict. If you ask somebody, how much would we emit between now and 2030, you're asking them the combination of two questions. How's our macroeconomy going to do between now and 2030? And I'm not a macroeconomist, but with no insult to my colleagues who are, we're really lousy at predicting a macroeconomy. And the other is how greenhouse gas intensive would each dollar of that GDP be? That is, are we going to get to a less greenhouse gas intensive economy? And that's also really hard to predict. So it's very hard to guess what that starting point we're going to have to cut back from would be. And therefore, it's very hard to figure out how much you actually have to cut back. Secondly, as John talked about, there are these overlapping or complementary policies. And although they are often, and the latest scoping plan does this, it gives you just a number. Here's how much we'll save with this policy. What it doesn't do, and I also think that people at ARB are great, although massively overworked and understaffed, but it doesn't say, and here's the level of uncertainty. How much plus or minus might we be getting out of tailpipe emission changes, out of the low carbon fuel standard, out of energy efficiency? And it turns out there's huge uncertainty about how much we're going to get out of those programs. There are other changes that were put in place to increase political support, primarily this giving free emissions to trade-exposed industries. That also has a tremendous amount of uncertainty. The supply can be expanded with approved offsets. ARB, because they're so rigorous about approving these, is well below the total number that they could approve. I said 8%. They're nowhere near approving 8% at this point because there haven't been enough protocols approved because they really are making people show that these are going to be additional. And this is probably the darkest underbelly of the cap and trade program, is there's a lot of things one can do in the state with switching what we count as our emissions by counting different, and the easiest one is electricity. The way electricity works is you put it on the grid, and once it's on the grid, electricity is electricity. You can't say my electricity came from this source or that source when you're getting it off the grid. It's all coming from the grid. So if we count the clean stuff, and Wyoming, which has a whole bunch of wind power, says, oh, we'll sell you our wind power, and we'll buy that coal-fired power, which is what Wyoming's doing, then we get to feel good about ourselves because we get to count the wind power towards our cap and trade program, but the Western grid has not gotten any cleaner. And so that's called reshuffling or resource shuffling or contract reshuffling. And you've probably heard of leakage. Leakage is, in general, the idea that you start constraining your emissions and instead the economic activity moves somewhere else. Reshuffling, it doesn't even have to move. You just count differently. So it's equivalent to saying, and you've probably heard this, that we won't buy our oil from country X, Saudi Arabia, Iran, whatever. And of course, there's a world oil market that all the oil goes into. And so if you don't buy your oil from a given source, it actually makes no difference. It just shuffles around where everybody gets their oil from. If you're not going to actually reduce your oil use, you're not actually changing things. So, John already presented this. Mine is more colorful but older, I think. But basically the point is cap and trade is a small share. There are all these other programs that were part of it. So instead of this, the real world looks like this. First of all, who knows where the cap is in terms of how much abatement you need. It will depend on how much the economy would have grown. So there's huge uncertainty there. Secondly, there's all this stuff that's going to happen whether you have a cap-and-trade program or not due to the complementary policies. In terms of the cap-and-trade program, that doesn't require any price to happen. It's going to happen at a price of zero. But as a result of that, when the price does start going up, you're not going to get a lot more abatement. And the most important thing that we came out of our analysis showing is that because of all these complications, a cap-and-trade program is very unlikely to actually end up on this part of the abatement curve where a little more price gives you a little more abatement. You're either going to be at the floor or you're going to get a very high price if the economy does well. And as I was doing the analysis back in 2013-14, and we started talking about this and estimating that the price could go to $70, $80, $100 a ton, we got told, no, it won't. Because the governor has the ability to suspend the program. And long before you got to $70, $80, or $100 a ton, because of the damage it would do to the California economy, the program would just be suspended. Now, that would be a complete disaster for climate change. If California sets the example of we tried a cap-and-trade program and we had to pull the plug on it, or we didn't pull the plug and the price went to $100 a ton and it caused real damage to the economy, either one would be a disaster for global climate change. So there is a price control mechanism. The good news is we have a floor, because the floor is the only thing that's giving us a serious price of greenhouse gases. A price. I wouldn't call $12.73 a serious price, but $12.73, which has been the floor, is about to go up to $13.50 or something like that. But it's the highest price on greenhouse gases of any cap-and-trade program, and one of the highest prices worldwide. It also has a ceiling. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the ceiling is a soft ceiling that essentially says if you, as the price goes up, will release more allowances. So the supply curve basically has all of these cheap, or they're not so cheap, but they're being done by complementary policies, so it's going to happen regardless of the price. And then a very narrow range of increasing price that will give us a little more abatement. And then there are these three steps where they throw in more allowances if the price gets high enough. And then beyond that, there's nothing to keep the price from shooting off even higher. Now, our committee strongly advised that a firm price ceiling be put in so that this doesn't happen. But at the same time, we estimated it's really unlikely to happen. And I'll show you our estimates in a minute, but basically, we estimated the most likely outcome, this was back in 2012 and 13, was we were going to be here at the price floor. And sure enough, that's what's happened. Had the economy just taken off, and in 2012, 13, suddenly the economy of California just skyrocketed, we could have ended up here. We could have ended up with a very high price. Even these prices, I was told, were not going to be politically acceptable, or even higher, which definitely wouldn't have been politically acceptable. So, as much as I started this analysis thinking, we got to have a price on greenhouse gases, tax is okay, cap-and-trade's okay, we just got to do something, my view has really changed. My view has changed that cap-and-trade is either much worse than a tax, or in practice not that different from a tax, because although you're going to call it a cap, you're not really going to have a cap. You're either going to be at the price floor and be below the cap, or there's a very small probability you'll be in this range where you're actually seeing more abatement as the price goes up, or you're going to have some sort of ceiling, or have the program canceled, which nobody wants to see happen. To show you why there's that uncertainty, these are the actual emissions that would have been covered by the program going back to 1990. And what everybody should probably remembers these years, this was the dot-com boom. California's economy was just skyrocketing then. And sure enough, take a look at what happened. Our emissions took off. If you asked an economist back here what's about to happen to the California economy, they would not have told you this. Because forecasting the movement of the macroeconomy is very tough. And of course, you all know what happened here. the California and U.S. economy tanked. If you asked an economist a couple of years before that, what's going to happen to emissions, they would not have forecast this. So if you ask an economist what's going to happen, or a non-economist, what's going to happen to greenhouse gas emissions of the state of California going out to 2030, what's the baseline we should be reducing from, if they tell you they know, they're making it up. There's huge uncertainty. We're working on estimates for all the way out to 2030, but the uncertainty is probably plus or minus 20% or 25% out per year out to 2030. And what that means is when you start talking about reducing another 20%, that's in the uncertainty of just what the BAU emissions are going to be. And so this idea that we know what we need to do and we know how it'll get us there is just not supported by the actual data. So this is our estimates back in 2012-13 of the probabilities. We thought there was a chance, the most likely was business as usual would be above the cap, but there was some chance without doing anything extra, we'd be below the cap. And sure enough, that's probably what happened. The economy was weak, and when the economy is weak, you don't emit much, and as a result, we're going to be easily under the cap by 2020, which is why you probably heard they have been selling many allowances lately. There's a bunch of inputs I'm not going to spend time on about adjusting for the shutdown of nuclear power plants, changes in the carbon intensity of transportation, looking at how people actually respond as the price goes up. But the bottom line is we estimated something that looks like this with complementary measures, reshuffling, offsets, all that could be done very cheaply or that we're going to get done regardless of the price. And then additional allowance of APCR from the Allowance Price Containment Reserve. And our estimates estimated that the most likely outcome this is based on data through 2012, which weren't released till 2015, or late 2014, was that we were almost certainly going to be at the floor. And sure enough, that's what's happened. The cap and trade program in California has been at the floor, and it is almost certainly going to stay at the floor through 2020 if we don't make any further changes. Here's the actual results. Just before the program opened, prices got up as high as 20-something. They gradually, and there were consulting firms that were forecasting 40 or 60, and then as it became clear, their forecasts continued to go down until they were pretty much in line with our forecast, which was at the floor. This isn't unusual. This is what's actually happened in the EU ETS and in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the eastern United States. In all these cases, they've started out with some uncertainty, but fairly quickly it's become clear that we're going to be at the floor. So if cap and trade so bad, are these other mechanisms better? A tax gives certainty about the price per unit of greenhouse gas release, but no certainty about quantity. I used to think that was a big difference from cap and trade. I now don't. Because I think in practice, what cap and trade is a price floor, a small chance you're in this intermediate range, and then you're going to have some price ceiling. Because politically, you're not going to let the price go to $100 or $150 a ton. And what that means is that a cap and trade program is essentially a tax with two possible levels, depending on whether you come in low or come in high. In the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, of course, is if you come in high, they cancel the program, which I already said would not be a good outcome. So people say, well, then we should just directly regulate. Well, it turns out that that's also got a lot of uncertainty. You can directly regulate. You can say, we're going to say that refineries have to have a certain level of efficiency, that cars have to hit a certain miles per gallon. But all the macroeconomic uncertainty is still going to be there. Because if you produce a lot of gasoline, even if you have low emissions per unit of gasoline, you're still going to have high emissions. If people drive a lot, even if they drive better fuel economy cars, they're still going to have high emissions. So, and in practice, those are still going to be very expensive programs. It's just that the expense is going to be hidden because it's going to be through these direct regulations. As I said, rigid caps put an upper bound on greenhouse gas release only if the price is really unconstrained. And we're not really willing to let the price go that high. I would be, and when I got asked, and I did, well, what's the appropriate price ceiling? I said, you tell me the dollar level at which the governor is going to suspend the program, and I will go $1 below that. And if he's willing to go to $100, 99 is the right price cap. And unfortunately, in practice, that number is probably 40 or 50 at most. I think there is this larger issue, which I have to spend a minute on, that we have to keep in mind what California is really doing in this fight. And that is not directly affecting climate change. We're 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. I think we really should be focused on what can we do that's going to create the technology and the knowledge, including organizing markets, for the rest of the world, and particularly for the developing world, because that's not where most of the emissions in the atmosphere today came from, but it's where most of the emissions are going to come from. So we need to create technologies that are inexpensive enough and effective enough that the developing world's going to adopt them. China talks a good game about wanting to do something about greenhouse gases, but they still build coal-fired power plants at a very rapid pace because it's cheap. And we need to figure out what can we export to the developing world that is going to be cost-effective that they're going to be willing to do. And I think that really we're losing track of that when we start talking about we have to hit a certain number of emissions for California, regardless of what it costs. Because if you do it in a very expensive way, you're just spending a lot of money to make ourselves feel good rather than actually reducing greenhouse gases in a way that's going to change climate change. So lastly, what does this all have to do with environmental justice? And here, John and I think, are maybe on different, not agree entirely. I really believe that the environmental justice issue, which is a tremendously important issue in certain areas, is really being led astray, and the climate change issue is being led astray by combining them. I think AB 197 is a huge mistake. I think the fact is that there are many things we can do about climate change that won't help environmental justice at all. And there are many things we can do about environmental justice that actually could make climate change worse or emissions worse. So if you want an electric generating plant to emit fewer local pollutants, the first technology is a scrubber. A scrubber lowers the energy efficiency of the plant. It means it emits more greenhouse gases per unit of electricity. So actually by improving the local air quality, you're actually increasing greenhouse gas emissions. My colleague and friend Bob Sawyer had told me long ago, who was the head of their resources board for a while, before he said too much and got fired, that old cars are the massive polluters. And as Bob put it to me, that wonderful old VW microbus that we have, some of us of a certain age have a warm spot in our hearts for, is massively more polluting than a brand new Hummer. Massively more polluting. Now, it gets better fuel economy, and fuel economy is greenhouse gases. I mean, it translates 1 for 1. So the fact that automobile is better on greenhouse gas release does not in any way correlate with its local pollution problem. So I think that tying these together is really making a mistake. I think there are real environmental justice concerns, but when we try to, and I understand the frustration of people in Richmond and people in West Oakland of not being heard, but I really think that trying to tie this to climate change is going to hobble the climate change activity by essentially saying we're going to put this additional very vague, even in AB 197, requirement for reductions. It says we have to emphasize communities that have environmental justice issues. We should be directly regulating and monitoring and controlling local pollutants. We should figure out what the right level is. Now, the air quality, the Air District, Bay Area Air Quality Management District, has their views. Apparently there's disagreement, and I haven't learned enough about the science and the monitoring. But that's a distinct issue. Trying to tie that to climate change, I think, is just a real mistake. Last thing I'll say about environmental justice that I've noticed in the last couple of years is there are two very distinct issues in environmental justice that often get confused. And one is reducing emissions in vulnerable communities. The other is whatever you reduce to, and we're not going to reduce to zero, there is going to be more damage in some communities than others. The other piece of this is compensating those communities for the damage. We have done this very informally in many areas. Refineries often end up cutting deals with city council where they pay for schools, where they pay for low-income housing, where they do other things. But it's all very ad hoc. And I think that part of the problem in the environmental justice response is a lot of communities, first of all, want lower emissions, but second of all, even if you hit a certain target, there's still going to be emissions, and those communities should still be compensated, and we're not doing that. So I have, on the Air District Council, actually said, well, why are we giving away for free the emissions up to that level, which is, by the way, what direct regulation does. It says you can have all you want, you can do up to this level, and we don't charge you anything. I think that's a real mistake. I think that we need to both focus on reducing emissions in vulnerable communities and in compensating the communities in a more rigorous way, in a more rational way that actually addresses those issues. So in practice, I think all mechanisms for greenhouse gas reduction leave uncertainty, including direct regulation. I know there is a move back towards that. I think that that's not the best way to do this. I think we just have to recognize there is going to be a lot of uncertainty. We're not going to hit a cap. We're not going to hit any one number because we're not going to know what the macroeconomy is going to do. I would say we shouldn't want to hit an exact number because we're kidding ourselves if we think us hitting an exact number is moving the ball forward. What's going to move the ball forward is improving technology in showing how this can be done in a cost-effective way. Because if you go to China, if you go to India and you say, look, we did it, it massively increased our cost of energy, but we did it, they're not going to be interested. And certainly if we do it by shutting down California refineries so that we then import gasoline instead, we're not doing anything and nobody's going to be impressed. What we really need to do is come up with the technologies and drive their costs down in a way that we have done. We've really contributed in solar panels, in battery technology, in wind, in ways that actually have had an important effect. That's, I think, where we should be focusing. Thank you very much. I see there's a big stack.
Okay. So remember, we are going to have both John and Severin come up together, but first of all, let's dive into some of these more detailed questions that you've just been producing or sharing with us from an economist's perspective. So are you saying, fee-wise, that nothing we are doing is making a difference in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that economic growth is the main driver? If so, how do we reduce embedded greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes, thank you for asking that, because this is a very important question. Pricing greenhouse gas emissions is still very important because it is going to be a part of what's going to give the incentives for companies to come up with better technology. So when you price greenhouse gas emissions, you make coal-fired power, not that we're using it at this point, less attractive, even gas-fired power relative to solar. So you make solar and wind more attractive. You do that in part by the Renewables Portfolio Standard, by supporting technological research, but also by putting a price on greenhouse gas emissions. What I'm just arguing is don't do that saying, well, then we have to get this exact number on emissions, because that is going to be primarily driven over the next couple decades by the macroeconomy. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be pricing. It means that we should be realistic about what it can accomplish. And we should remember to keep our eye on the ball, which is the ball is worldwide emissions, not California.
You mentioned that you had concerns about the offset program. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I do have concerns about the offset program, but actually I think that offset programs in general, I think ARB has been much more rigorous than the EU ETS and than a number of other programs in making people show that these are actually things that would not have been done otherwise. That is, these are projects that weren't economically feasible, but would be done because of this. And actually, John's point about the coal bed methane is a great example. There's actually a story I teach a course in energy and environmental markets, and when I teach about offsets, one of the cases I teach is a Chinese company that made refrigerant chemicals, which released a really horrible high greenhouse gas impact chemical. And it turned out when we started paying them to capture that and reduce it, that made it economic for them to continue producing refrigerants. And so that's exactly the sort of problem you run into, and John's pointed out that would be a real concern with coal bed methane, that if you're going to start paying for that. So ARB has been very careful about that, but it's a tough case. Still, for now, there are emissions that are not in any price program, and if you can get to them with offsets, and they're rigorously monitored, I think that's better than nothing.
Okay. Why not both cap and trade and a carbon tax? Also, can we really meet the demands of avoiding a tipping point with the notion of a constantly expanding world economy?
Great question. The second one. The first one, a cap and trade and a carbon tax would be sort of doubling up on the same mechanism. Both of them are going to put a price on emissions. So having both of them is duplicating the process and unnecessarily. Can we avoid a tipping point? We have to remember that there may be a tipping point. The science is not exactly clear on how stark that tipping point is, but we definitely don't know where that tipping point is. So as we emit more, the probability of hitting major climate change goes up. And so we should not be giving up by saying, oh, we're not going to avoid a tipping point. We don't know where that tipping point is, and we don't know how bad that is relative to the next tipping point and the even worse damage. So I think that we have to be working at this and trying to reduce greenhouse gases, even if at this point there are going to be, and there is going to be, substantial climate change from what's already happened. So we really need to focus on reducing what we can.
Thanks. Thank you for coming. So, if California is the 5th largest economy in the world, how can California greenhouse gas reductions not impact global warming and be a model for the world?
Well, California is actually, I think, the 6th or 8th largest, but we can talk about that. The fact is California's greenhouse gases are about 1% of world greenhouse gases. This is in part because China's greenhouse gases have just massively taken off in the last 10 years. If you look at coal-fired power, what you'll see is in every coal burn in every other part of the world, but China and India, it's sort of flattened, and in China, it's just taken off exponentially. So we have a very greenhouse gas efficient economy. Now that's partially because we're not counting it fairly. We import all this stuff that has a lot of greenhouse gas intensity. We don't smelt aluminum in California. We import the aluminum and we don't count that towards our greenhouse gases. But California, on what we can control, is about 1% of world greenhouse gas emissions. It's not to say we shouldn't work on it, but I think we have to keep our eye on the real goal is to work on it in a way that creates the technologies that the developing world is going to adopt.
if we cap emissions without trading for permits, will the increased price of fossil fuel increase oil company profits without actually providing revenues to government? So are oil companies able to continue their profit taking even though they're subject to, buying allowances and some kind of cap?
So I could spend an hour on oil company economics, but the vast majority of oil company profits come from oil production, not from the refining part. We have no control over that. The only thing we can do to reduce oil company production is consume less oil products. That is, higher fuel-efficient cars, fewer cars, period, etc. They do make money off of refining, and if we cap refining, they're going to make more money per unit of gasoline they sell, because basically we're going to drive up the price of gasoline in California. And so I think, and I've said this at the Air District meetings, refinery-specific caps will do nothing good for greenhouse gases. It could, particularly if we massively ratcheted down refinery operations in California, help the communities around those refineries. But I don't think we should be doing that through greenhouse gas restrictions. We should be doing that directly, looking at how much damage are those local pollutants doing, and what should we do to reduce that damage. Not trying to do it through this back door of greenhouse gas emissions, I think is very likely to lead to unforeseen consequences of the sort that I mentioned, that if you do this with scrubbers on power plants, by actually reducing local pollutants, they increase greenhouse gas emissions. So you can't always be sure these things are going to be correlated.
Okay, we're going to wrap up this section and actually have John and Severin both come up here and continue to take your questions. And they can both kind of interact a little bit about their different perspectives or information.
9 o'clock in the morning and give up my Friday night to listen to this shit. That might make it more.
Okay, this is one that goes to the work that many of the people in this room do, which is mobilizing, organizing, and educating for public to be involved in these discussions and decisions being made. So it sounds like for either cap or trade or a carbon tax, a missing piece is the political will to set a tax high enough or a cap low enough to have the needed result. How do we build political will and or cost of reducing emissions?
Well, this is part of the reason I disagree with Sev about linking control of greenhouse gas emissions with control of health damaging pollutants. Actually, there is some political will on the part of the California legislature, in part because of the power of the Latino caucus, to link environmental justice issues with anything we do in terms of the environment. But the biggest thing we're doing is climate change mitigation. So I actually think that, while I understand from an economist's point of view the rationality of separating the two, and I understand, I think you can push a refinery to put in a scrubber and make it more efficient. And so I think you can do both. We're actually required by AB 32 and AB 197 to do both. So while it does make it a little trickier, I totally agree. I think we have to. So in terms of the political will, but my answer to the question about we need to do better outreach is definitely the same, that we do have to get the public to realize the importance of investing in climate change mitigation to protect our future. And I also totally agree with Sev that California is really in a leadership role, not a role where we're really going to make a difference on the climate, in terms of climate change. But we can make a difference locally. And I think that there's nothing wrong politically with combining the two. I think it makes it more effective to combine the two. It does make it more technically difficult to implement both.
So I'm certainly not a good analyst of the politics, but I do worry that when we go down this road, we're setting ourselves up for the sort of report that my colleagues at Berkeley put out that say, boy, this has been a huge disappointment on local pollution. To which, when I first came out, I thought, of course it's been a huge disappointment on local pollution. It wasn't about local pollution. And that we should have regulations about local pollution. Although, again, I'm no politics expert, Democrats now have 2/3 of both houses. I think that now is the time to actually directly address local pollution issues and figure out what the right technologies are and not try to do it through climate change. Now, John.
I just wanted to warn people about the supermajority. You know, the piece of SB 350 that didn't get passed was the 50% reduction in transportation fossil fuels combustion, and you know these were Democrats that were peeled off of the Democratic plurality. So I don't think the supermajority means that we're going to suddenly be able to push the oil companies into places they don't want to go very easily. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
I'll actually say that I was one of the people who said that part of SB 350 was a mistake. There was no pathway to get to what was being proposed, and I thought it was just unrealistic. I think that reducing local pollution to a greater extent in these disadvantaged communities is a more realistic goal. But again, it may be that politically you have to link them. I would, in that case, hope we can link them in a way that is maybe in the same bill, but not so directly counting on greenhouse gas reductions to also reduce local pollution, because I think that's almost certainly going to lead to disappointment.
So this kind of builds on this exact question. Are there actually examples where improving local air quality and reducing greenhouse gas emissions do align? Or should that just be separate?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, there are lots of examples where when a refinery improves their heat capture and energy efficiency, they reduce greenhouse gases and they reduce local pollutants. So it's not that they're never correlated. It's just that, in general, when you just say reduce greenhouse gases, you have, I think, a very poor chance of getting the result on local pollution.
Just one somewhat related comment. In Laura Cushing's report about the big greenhouse gas emitters, the cement industry is sort of singled out as a bad actor, and cement plants emit all sorts of stuff, greenhouse gases and health-damaging pollutants. But the cement industry association came to lobby me. That's part of my job as a CARB member, to listen to various stakeholders, and I always agree. And they said that, first off, most of their plants, and there's only 5 left in the state, are not surrounded by a high-density population, because nobody wants a cement plant. So there aren't that many people affected. I don't know the accuracy of that. But they also said, if you make business tougher for us, people are just going to import cement from China, which makes cement very cheaply. And then there'll be all sorts of emissions at the port from the ships that bring the cement over and all the trucks that I have to deliver it to wherever it's going. So that's where I agree with Seb. We've got to be careful about unintended consequences.
And if that happens, whether it's with cement, steel, or refined oil products, greenhouse gas emissions go up because we end up doing it in a less regulated environment, plus having the transportation emissions.
For whatever it's worth, CapTrade auctions have brought in about $3.2 billion for mitigation efforts, including the governor's high-speed rail project. What do you think about these investments? Could they be more effectively used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or stimulate the technology, perhaps, that's needed to transition to new?
Well, if I told you what I really thought about the high-speed rail, I'd be in trouble with the guy who keeps me on the board. I think you know how I feel. A former board member from the Central Valley actually called it the train to nowhere. But yeah, I mean, I think that if we were really spending the money on high-impact greenhouse gas emission reduction projects, that's what the money really should be for. I don't have a problem with the AB 1550 requirement that 25% go to disadvantaged communities, because that is sort of necessary. That was necessary for the political support to keep the legislature invested in moving forward with climate change policy, mitigation policy. So I would like to see investments be the most efficient as possible in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We don't always have the knowledge technically about what's the best way to invest. But, you know, personally, from a non-expert point of view, I would say that we need to figure out how to store renewable power better and to transmit it better. Because Southern California is where most of the wind and solar power is, and getting it up north is not the easiest thing right now.
I'll just throw out one other idea which I've been occasionally hawking, which is when the stem cell research under the Bush administration was cut off, California started the Regenerative Medicine Institute to do that research, which was going to have global benefits here, because knowledge creation is California's comparative advantage. I would like to see some of that money go to that sort of science research that is really to get better support for storage technology, for alternative generation technology. I would also support it for carbon capture and sequestration. I think we should be doing everything. We really need to find solutions that the developing world is going to be willing to adopt. And CCS may be it. I'm not saying it is, and I know there have been some real disappointments, but we have to be open to those, plus nascent technology, wave technology, and so forth. And I think that I would like to see more of the money spent with that vision towards changing the world's emissions.
Okay. We're just about at time. I'll do one more question, and we'll save these questions and figure out what we can do, maybe a frequently asked questions list, and share that with all of you. So there seems to be two messages, Severin, to the way you're looking at the economic dynamics here. So if allowances reach $50 per ton, which becomes too expensive and the governor pulls cap and trade, why is that a disaster? If it doesn't work, shouldn't we just drop it?
I think if allowances reach a level and the governor shuts down the program, that gets read worldwide as market mechanisms for reducing greenhouse gases are a failure. This is just not going to work. We should, I think it would really undermine global support for reducing greenhouse gases, and that I think would be a disaster.
Something that I've been wanting to say is that the current cap and trade mechanism isn't just California. It's also Quebec right now, and Ontario is about to link with us. And the original plan had been to involve the, I think it was Washington, Oregon, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada. They pulled out with the recession and political change. But I still think that's one potential advantage of the cap and trade mechanism that we have. It's more easily linked to other entities than a carbon tax. And then another thing I wanted to share was Hector De La Torre, who was my colleague on the Resources Board, former assembly person from Southern California, and a really sharp guy, and somebody with political savvy who also cares about environmental justice. During the last board meeting, November 17th, there were some folks, maybe some of you were there, from the environmental justice community that were talking about wouldn't the carbon tax be better? And he turned to me and said, John, is it time for one of my lectures about political reality? And I said, I don't know. Hector, you know better than me what's political reality. But he doesn't think a carbon tax would get through the legislature, even with a supermajority.
And actually, that's part of why I think the extension of cap and trade won't be a carbon tax, but I hope it will be a higher floor and a real ceiling so that we have a program that is fundamentally stable, because I think the program we have now is a greater risk.
Okay, well, let's give a warm appreciation to there's a lot of information with us, some of which you may have known and some of which you're still trying to figure out. I just want to just take the chair's prerogative. And this is a group of people in this room this morning who are leaders of citizen or resident-based climate activist groups. And to the extent that you have anything to say to us about the role that we can play, now's the time to do it. You want more of us coming to meet with you? You want more proposals coming forth from us? Give us your sense of that.
Well, I don't know how many of you have been up at CAR board meetings. Can I see a... Okay, so that's pretty good. But, they're public meetings. And, Sacramento's not that far. I take the train up there. It's actually fun to commute that way. And I think the more the public is present at the board meetings, the better. It does move people on the board. When we were implementing the heavy-duty truck and bus rule, which I was very supportive of and still am, we heard from a lot of independent truckers, have 2 or 3 trucks, how we were totally destroying their livelihood, which we actually kind of were. And that made a difference in terms of, we backed off on certain requirements. Then the big trucking companies got mad at us and they said it's not a level playing field. But what I'm saying is that when enough people show up at board meetings, we listen. So I think if you want your voice to be heard, you have to show up at the board meetings. And also meet with the board members, because our job, we're not supposed to turn down requests to meet with people.
Okay, well, thanks again for joining us this morning, Saturday morning. It's still going to be a beautiful day, so it didn't take up your whole day, but we sure appreciate you joining us today. Thank you. Okay, so we now have time for a 10-minute break to get up and move around and actually talk to one another. We kind of imposed these tables on you, thinking you could have some discussion in addition to the questions you've submitted. If there's something burning that you think you'd like to talk to other folks about, this is a time to do that, but it's also a time for a break. So I think there's still food and refreshments back there. Again, the bathroom is down this hall past the glass doors, and then turn left. And we'll convene at, I think, 11:55 now, so you don't have to even have 8 minutes. Sorry about that. So at least you can get up and stretch and walk around.